What if I told you that surviving a single Victorian winter required more courage than most of us will ever need in our entire lives? That behind every frosted windowpane in 1840s England, ordinary people were performing quiet acts of heroism just to see another dawn. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where winter wasn't a season, it was a test. Where the difference between life and death could be as simple as whether your neighbor shared their last piece of coal, or whether the ice on your water basin was too thick to break with numb fingers. Before we dive in, I need a quick favor. Tap that like button if you're ready to step back in time with me tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss our late-night journeys into history's forgotten corners. Let's make this a real community moment. Drop a comment right now and tell me, where are you listening from? What time is it for you? Maybe some of you are up late in the US, others just waking up in Europe, or tuning in from somewhere halfway across the world. I love seeing how far this little circle of time travelers can reach. Because trust me, what comes next is a story you won't want to miss. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a gentle fan for that soothing background hum. And let's settle in for tonight's quiet journey through history. We're traveling to a small village somewhere in the English countryside, where the snow has been falling for 3 days straight, and the year is 1847. The church bells have grown muffled under their blanket of frost, and smoke rises in thin, precious threads from chimneys that seem too small for the cold they're fighting. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world, we'll discover what it truly meant to endure winter, when survival was never guaranteed. And warmth was something you earned, not something you assumed. The church bell tolls 5 times in the darkness, each note dulled and distant through the thick blanket of snow that has been falling for 3 days. You stir beneath your thin woolen coverlet, feeling the familiar bite of cold air against your cheek, the only part of your face not buried deep within the rough fabric. Your breath creates small clouds even here. Beneath the shared covers in this modest stone cottage where the walls seem to hold the cold like a memory that refuses to fade, imagine yourself there, in that moment between sleep and waking, when your body knows it must rise, but every fiber resists the coming struggle with the day. The straw mattress beneath you has grown damp from the moisture of breath and bodies, and somewhere in the darkness, you can hear the soft snoring of your younger brother beside you, the wheeze of your mother's chest from the corner where she sleeps with the baby. Your feet find the floor, rough-hewn planks that shock your skin with their icy touch. The rhythm of your days begins always like this, with this small act of courage. This daily decision to leave the meager warmth of your bed and face what winter has brought overnight. You fumble for the worn leather boots beside your pallet, feeling their stiff coldness, the way the frost has worked its way even here, into this innermost sanctuary of your home. The cottage around you breathes with the quiet sounds of a household slowly stirring. Your father coughs, that dry, persistent sound that has grown worse since the cold settled deep into the valley 3 weeks ago. The baby whimpers once, then settles back into whatever dreams babies find in the long darkness of winter mornings. These are the sounds of survival, small and unremarkable, yet precious in their familiar repetition. You dress by feel rather than sight, pulling on the same rough woolen stockings you've worn for a week now, the same thick wool skirt that carries the lingering scent of wood smoke and the sweet staleness of bodies, too long without proper washing. The chemise goes on first, its coarse linen scratching against skin that has grown accustomed to constant slight discomfort. Layer upon layer, each piece a barrier between you and the cold that seeps through every crack in the stone walls. Every gap where the mortar has crumbled away. The ritual of lighting the fire comes next, and this is where each day truly begins its quiet battle. You kneel before the hearth, where last night's embers have dwindled to the faintest red glow beneath a carpet of ash. Your fingers already stiff with cold, work to arrange the precious kindling. Bits of bark and dried grass gathered weeks ago, when the weather still permitted such luxuries. The coal in the scuttle beside the fireplace represents a careful calculation. It's enough to warm the cottage for perhaps 2 hours of morning comfort, or stretched thin across the entire day for just enough heat to keep the frost from forming inside the windows. The flint strikes once, twice, 3 times before the spark catches, and you blow gently on the tiny flame, feeling how your breath mingles with the smoke, how the bitter taste of charcoal touches your tongue. This moment, when fire blooms from cold darkness, feels like a small miracle performed daily. A victory so routine, it has almost ceased to feel like victory at all. As the flames grow, casting dancing shadows on the stone walls, you can see your breath beginning to thin, the visible proof of your warmth gradually fading. The cottage takes shape around you in the growing light. A single room where 4 people have learned to live with less privacy than cattle in a field, where every possession must justify its existence by its usefulness. The wooden table, scarred from years of use, bears the marks of countless meals stretched to feed more mouths than the food was meant to satisfy. The shelf beside the window holds the few precious items that have survived the constant need to sell or trade for food. A pewter mug with a dent in its side, a wooden spoon carved smooth by your grandfather's hands, a small ceramic bowl that catches and holds water for washing when the well hasn't frozen solid. Your mother stirs as the fire begins to warm the air, and you see her face in the flickering light, worn smooth by work and worry, but carrying still the remnants of the beauty that convinced your father to marry her 17 years ago. She rises without a word, moving to the basin on the windowsill where ice has formed in delicate patterns across the surface of the water left from yesterday's washing. The sound of ice breaking fills the cottage, sharp little cracks like tiny bones snapping, as she prepares for the day's first washing, the ritual cleaning that marks the boundary between night's vulnerability and day's endurance. The baby wakes, as babies do, with small sounds that grow gradually into demands. Your mother lifts him from his nest of rags and worn blankets, holding him close to her chest, where the warmth of her body can shield him from the cold that seems to press against the windows like something alive and hungry. You watch her face as she feels his forehead with the back of her hand, checking for the fever that took your sister 2 winters ago, the same fever that visits every cottage in the village when the cold settles deep and refuses to lift. Your father rises with the deliberate movements of a man whose body has been broken down and rebuilt by 30 years of farm labor. His hands, when he reaches for his boots, move with the careful stiffness of joints that have learned to accommodate pain as a permanent resident. The cough that woke you earlier comes again, deeper now, and he turns his head away to spare the rest of you from whatever his lungs are trying to expel. This is consideration born of necessity. In a space this small, illness shared is illness multiplied. The morning meal appears on the table as if by magic, though you know it represents the careful management of resources that would challenge a merchant's ledger. Porridge made from oats stretched with whatever can be added to increase its volume without destroying its nourishment. Bits of turnip saved from yesterday's dinner, a handful of barley gleaned from the edges of the miller's field. Water flavored with the memory of the bacon bone that provided 3 days of thin soup before finally giving up its last essence to the pot. You eat slowly, not from leisure, but from the knowledge that this warmth in your belly must sustain you for many hours of work in the cold. The porridge tastes of salt and earth, of the minerals drawn from vegetables that have spent long months sleeping in the root cellar beneath the cottage. It is filling without being satisfying, nourishing without being abundant, warming without providing the deep satisfaction that comes from eating beyond the requirements of mere survival. The walk to work begins before the sun has properly risen, though sunrise in winter feels more like a gradual lessening of darkness than any true emergence of light. You step outside into air so cold it seems to crackle against your skin, air that turns your breath into thick clouds that hang in the stillness before slowly dissolving into the gray morning. The snow beneath your feet has the particular crunch of snow that is frozen and thawed and frozen again, creating a surface that gives way unexpectedly, sending you lurching forward to catch your balance. The village lanes stretch before you like frozen rivers, marked by the tracks of those who have already begun their daily journey toward whatever work the season permits. Here, the footprints of Mary Whitlock, who rises an hour earlier than anyone else to tend the fire at the big house before the family wakes. The deeper impressions left by Thomas Beer's wooden clogs as he made his way to the barn where the milk cows wait in their patient misery for someone to relieve the pressure in their udders. Every step sends small shocks of cold up through your legs, the thin soles of your boots providing a little barrier between your feet and the frozen ground. The cold seems to have its own weight, pressing down on your shoulders, making each breath require conscious effort. You pull your shawl tighter around your head, but the wind finds every gap in your defenses, every place where fabric doesn't quite meet fabric, sending its icy fingers to trace along your neck and down your spine. The work that waits for you at the end of this walk is the work that has defined your life since childhood. The endless cycle of tasks that keep a household functioning when every simple act requires planning and effort. If you are a woman, perhaps you walk toward the stream where the washing waits, where you will kneel on stones that seem designed to bruise your knees, plunging your hands into water so cold it makes your bones ache. The soap, made from ash and animal fat, leaves your skin raw and cracked, but the washing must be done, clothes must be cleaned. And the standards of cleanliness that separate respectable poverty from degradation must be maintained, regardless of the cost to your comfort. If your path leads toward the fields, you face a day of clearing ditches of ice, mending fences that have been damaged by the weight of snow, feeding animals whose needs continue regardless of weather. The cattle stand in their pen like monuments to suffering, their breath creating clouds of steam that dissipate immediately in the cold air. Their eyes, when you look into them, seem to hold the same patient endurance that you see in the faces of your neighbors. The acceptance of hardship as the natural condition of existence. The work continues through the short winter day, each task made more difficult by fingers that refuse to bend properly, by feet that have lost sensation hours ago, by the constant need to stop and blow on your hands or stamp your feet to maintain enough circulation to continue functioning. The sun, when it finally appears, provides light without warmth, casting everything in a pale, thin illumination that seems to emphasize rather than relieve the coldness of the world. Lunch, when it comes, is often eaten while standing. A piece of bread and perhaps a small portion of cheese consumed quickly before the cold can steal away whatever warmth the food might provide. You eat with your back turned to the wind, cupping the food in your hands to protect it from the elements that seem determined to take away even this small comfort. The afternoon brings its own challenges as the temperature begins to drop toward the evening's inevitable depths. Your clothes, damp from exertion, despite the cold, begin to stiffen against your skin. The wool of your skirt holds moisture like a sponge, creating a heavy, clammy embrace that seems to draw warmth from your body rather than provide it. Your breath comes in shorter puffs now, each exhalation a small surrender of the heat that your body works so hard to maintain. The journey home begins before darkness falls completely, but in winter's grip, darkness comes early and stays long. The familiar landmarks of the village appear as dim shapes in the gathering gloom, the church spire barely visible against the clouded sky, the mill wheel frozen solid beside the stream that has slowed to a thin trickle between walls of ice. The windows of the cottages begin to glow with the warm yellow light of oil lamps and candles, each one representing a small victory against the encroaching cold and dark. Your cottage, when you finally reach it, feels warm only in comparison to the world outside. The fire that seemed so robust this morning has dwindled to a bed of coals that provide more hope than heat. The evening meal begins with the ritual of coaxing the fire back to life, feeding it carefully with the fuel that must last until morning, calculating each piece of coal against the hours of cold that stretch ahead. Dinner consists of whatever could be prepared during the brief morning warmth, perhaps a thin stew made from the bones of Sunday's chicken, stretched with turnips and onions stored in the cellar, flavored with herbs dried from last summer's garden. The pot sits close to the fire, its contents sending small wisps of steam into the cold air of the cottage. Each bowlful represents warmth as much as nourishment. The heat of the soup spreading through your body like a small furnace temporarily kindled within your chest. The family gathers around the table as darkness settles completely over the village outside. The baby sleeps in your mother's arms, wrapped in every soft thing the household can spare. Your brother, younger than you but old enough to work, shows the same signs of the day's struggle, reddened cheeks, stiff movements, the particular exhaustion that comes from fighting cold for 10 hours. Your father eats in silence, his attention focused on the precious warmth of the food, on storing up whatever energy he can for tomorrow's repetition of today's endurance. Conversation, when it comes, is practical rather than leisurely. A discussion of the weather, how long this cold might last, whether the snow will continue, if the stream will freeze completely, and force a longer walk to the well in the next village. The evening's work continues, even after the meal is finished. Clothes must be dried near the fire, mended where the day's labor has torn them, prepared for tomorrow's wearing. Your mother works by the light of a single candle, her fingers moving with the practiced skill of someone who has learned to make thread and fabric last far beyond their intended lifespan. The needle moves in and out of the coarse cloth, creating small repairs that will extend the useful life of a garment by weeks or months. You sit close to the fire, feeling its warmth on your face, while your back remains touched by the cold air that seems to seep through the walls themselves. This is the geography of winter survival. The careful positioning of your body to capture whatever warmth is available while accepting that complete comfort is not possible. Your hands finally beginning to regain feeling after the day's work. Tingle with the peculiar pain that comes when circulation returns to fingers that have been too cold for too long. The baby wakes and cries, his small voice seeming impossibly loud in the quiet cottage. Your mother soothes him with soft sounds and gentle rocking. But you can see the worry in her face as she feels his forehead again, checking for signs of the illness that strikes so quickly in weather like this. Every parent in the village carries this fear. The knowledge that children are more vulnerable to the cold, that a fever or cough that might be merely uncomfortable in warm weather can become dangerous when the body is already stressed by constant exposure to cold. The preparations for sleep begin while the fire still holds some warmth. Heated stones are wrapped in cloth and placed at the foot of the bed to provide some warmth for sleeping feet. Every available covering is gathered, worn quilts, old coats, even pieces of canvas that can provide another layer against the cold. The sleeping arrangements are planned with the precision of military strategy. Who will sleep where to maximize shared warmth? How to position bodies to create the most effective barriers against drafts. The fire is banked for the night with careful attention to conservation. Enough fuel to maintain some coals until morning, but not so much as to waste precious resources on heat for sleeping bodies that can, with sufficient covering, generate their own warmth. The cottage grows dim as the flames die down, filled with the soft sounds of a family settling into the vulnerability of sleep in a hostile season. You lie in the darkness, feeling the cold slowly reclaim the spaces that fire had briefly warmed. The walls seem to conduct the outside temperature directly into the room, and you can hear the wind picking up outside, sending small drafts through cracks you cannot see but can definitely feel. Your body gradually warms the space beneath the covers, creating a small pocket of comfort that you protect jealously, keeping very still to avoid letting cold air disturb this precious warmth. The baby's breathing settles into the rhythm of sleep, and your mother's soft humming fades into silence. Your father's cough comes less frequently now, but when it does come, it echoes in the small space like a reminder of mortality. Your brother shifts beside you, unconsciously seeking warmth, and you allow him to move closer. Understanding without words this basic need for shared body heat that overrides normal boundaries of personal space. Sleep comes slowly, fought for, and earned, rather than simply received. You listen to the sounds of the village settling into its winter night, the distant barking of a dog, the creak of snow-laden tree branches, the occasional sound of footsteps as someone makes a late journey to the privy or the woodshed. These sounds form the lullaby of winter survival, the audio landscape of a community enduring together what no individual could survive alone. In your dreams, you find yourself warm. Summer sun touches your face, and you work in fields green with growing things. Your hands are not cracked from cold. Your feet are not numb from walking on frozen ground. But even in the dream, you know it is temporary. That morning will bring the familiar bite of cold air and the daily battle to maintain life in the face of a season that seems designed to test the limits of human endurance. The rhythm of your days continues, endless and necessary. A quiet heroism performed by thousands of people, whose names history will never record but whose persistence makes all other history possible. As the wind settles into a softer whisper against the cottage windows, let us turn our attention to one particular life. A thread in the vast tapestry of winter survival that stretched across countless English villages in those distant decades. Her name was Mary Hartwell, and in the winter of 1847, she was 23 years old, with hands that had already learned every lesson that cold and work could teach. Mary rises each morning at 4:30, not because an alarm calls to her, but because her body has trained itself to wake in the deep darkness, responding to some internal rhythm that measures survival in increments of preparation. She lives alone in a cottage barely larger than a horse stall, inherited from her aunt, who died the previous autumn of a lung fever that settled in her chest, like smoke that would never clear. The cottage itself tells the story of generations who lived close to the edge of survival. The walls, built of local stone quarried from the hillside to centuries past, have settled unevenly over time, creating gaps that no amount of clay and straw can permanently seal. The roof, thatched with reeds from the marshy ground near the stream, requires constant attention, loose stems that work free in windstorms. Thin patches where rain finds its way through to drip steadily into pots and basins placed with mathematical precision on the dirt floor below. Picture her there, in that first moment of consciousness, when her mind surfaces from dreams of warmth into the sharp reality of winter air against her cheek. The cottage around her breathes with the particular silence of deep cold, a quiet so complete it seems to muffle even her thoughts. The single window, no larger than a book, shows nothing but darkness pressed against the glass like a living thing seeking entrance. In those first moments of waking, Mary's breath forms small clouds that dissipate quickly in the frigid air. The wooden frame of her bed, inherited along with everything else from her aunt. Beside her bed sits a chamber pot, its ceramic surface cold enough to burn skin on contact, and a small table that holds her few precious possessions. A pewter cup dented from years of use, a bone-handled knife that serves for everything from cutting bread to mending clothes, and a small wooden box containing the copper coins that represent her entire worldly wealth. Mary's morning ritual begins with the same careful inventory that occupies the first thoughts of everyone in the village. What fuel remains? What food waits in the larder? What work the day might bring? What small disasters might be prevented by foresight and planning? She sits up slowly, feeling how the cold has settled into her bones during the night, how it requires conscious effort to convince her body that movement is possible. The mathematics of survival governs every choice. 3 pieces of coal remain in the small bucket beside the fireplace, enough for perhaps 6 hours of minimal heat if she is careful. She feeds the fire with just enough fuel to maintain a flame, without achieving actual warmth. The bread wrapped in cloth on the shelf may last 2 days if she cuts the portions smaller, if she allows hunger to become a familiar companion rather than an emergency to be immediately addressed. The fire died hours ago, surrendering its warmth to the inexorable cold that seeps through every gap in the stone walls. Mary strikes flint to tinder with fingers that remember the motion even when they cannot feel the metal. The spark catches, grows, becomes flame. And for a moment the cottage fills with dancing light that transforms the stark poverty of her surroundings into something that might, with generous imagination, be called cozy. The ritual of building fire has become meditation through necessity. Mary learned from her aunt the precise angle at which to hold the tinder, the exact moment when spark becomes flame, becomes heat. She learned to read the quality of smoke, to understand when flames burn clean, and when they waste fuel through inefficient combustion. These lessons, passed from one generation of solitary women to the next, constitute an education in survival that no formal schooling could provide. She owns 12 items of clothing, and each one serves a specific purpose in the daily battle against cold. The woolen stockings, darned so many times that more thread than original fabric remains. The heavy skirt that falls to her ankles, providing coverage at the cost of freedom of movement. The chemise that scratches against skin grown accustomed to constant slight irritation. Layer by layer she constructs the armor that will allow her to venture outside and perform the work that keeps her alive. Her undergarments, made from coarse linen that grows softer with each washing but never truly comfortable, serve as the foundation for the careful construction of warmth. Over these come the woolen stockings, knitted by her own hands during the previous summer, when yarn could be purchased cheaply from a traveling merchant. The wool, though rough and still smelling faintly of the sheep from which it came, provides insulation that makes the difference between mere discomfort and actual danger from cold. The dress itself, her only good garment, shows the careful maintenance that extends the life of irreplaceable possessions. Every seam has been reinforced. Every worn spot carefully patched with scraps saved from other garments too damaged to repair. The fabric, originally brown, has faded to a color that exists somewhere between earth and shadow, making Mary nearly invisible as she moves through the winter landscape, a practical advantage when anonymity provides safety for a woman traveling alone. Mary works as a laundress, which means her days are spent with her hands in water that hovers just above freezing, scrubbing clothes that belong to families wealthy enough to send their washing out rather than do it themselves. The work requires her to walk 2 miles each morning to the stream where the other washerwomen gather, their breath creating clouds of vapor that mingle and dissipate in the cold air like prayers made visible. The profession of laundress occupies a particular place in the village hierarchy. It's necessary but not respectable, essential but not valued. The women who wash clothes handle the most intimate possessions of their social superiors, learning secrets through stains and wear patterns that reveal more about family life than any gossip. Mary has washed clothes stained with blood and other bodily fluids, garments that speak of birth and death, sickness and health, violence and tenderness. She has learned to see without judging, to clean without commenting, to maintain the discretion that keeps her employed. The basket she carries holds not only the tools of her trade, blocks of harsh soap, a wooden paddle worn smooth by years of use, strips of cloth for drying her hands, but also the small provisions that will sustain her through the long day. A piece of bread wrapped in paper, a small jar of weak tea that will be cold by the time she drinks it, perhaps an apple stored in the cellar since autumn, skin wrinkled but its flesh still holding memories of sunshine and warmth. The soap, made from animal fat and lie in proportions that create a substance more caustic than cleansing, burns the skin even as it removes dirt and stains. Mary's hands bear permanent marks from daily contact with this harsh necessity, patches of skin that never fully heal, fingernails that grow thick and yellow, knuckles that crack and bleed in cold weather despite her careful attempts to protect them with rags soaked in the small amount of precious lanolin she can afford to purchase. Her wooden paddle, carved from ash wood by the village carpenter's grandfather, bears the smooth polish that comes only from decades of use. The handle fits her grip perfectly, worn to match the exact shape of her palm and fingers. This tool, simple as it appears, presents the accumulated knowledge of generations of washerwomen who understood the precise angle needed to drive water from fabric, exact amount of force required to remove stains without destroying cloth. The walk through the village in the pre-dawn darkness requires careful attention to footing, as ice forms in patches where drainage is poor, creating treacherous spots that can send an unwary walker sprawling. Mary knows every irregularity in the lane, every place where water pools and freezes, every stone that projects just enough to catch a hurried foot. This knowledge, accumulated over years of making the same journey in all weather, represents a form of survival expertise that no school could teach. The village itself sleeps fitfully during these deepest hours of night. Smoke rises from those chimneys where families can afford to maintain fires through the darkness. But many cottages show no signs of warmth, their inhabitants huddled under every available covering, waiting for dawn to justify the expense of fuel. Mary passes these dark windows with the particular sympathy of someone who understands exactly what lies behind them. People like herself, measuring survival in increments of coal and bread, making calculations that determine whether they will wake warm or cold, fed or hungry. The path to the stream follows the ancient route worn by countless feet over centuries of use. In summer, this walk takes Mary through meadows where wildflowers create patterns of color that change with the weeks, where the air carries the scent of growing things and the promise of abundance. In winter, the same path becomes a journey through a landscape stripped to its essential elements: earth, stone, ice, and the skeletal remains of trees that seem to reach toward a sky offering no warmth in return. At the stream, she joins the quiet community of women whose lives revolve around this daily gathering beside water that runs dark and quick between banks lined with ice. They work mostly in silence, the cold making conversation an expenditure of energy that cannot be spared, but their shared presence provides a comfort that goes beyond words. Here is Margaret, whose husband died in a mining accident and who supports 3 children with her washing. There stands Elizabeth, whose back is curved from years of bending over washtubs, but whose hands still move with the practiced efficiency of someone who has found dignity in necessary work. Margaret arrives each morning carrying not only her basket of washing supplies, but also a small cloth bag containing pieces of bread for her children's breakfast. Portions so carefully measured that each crumb represents a conscious decision about family survival. Her face bears the particular expression of women who have learned to worry about multiple lives simultaneously, who perform mental calculations that balance their own needs against those of dependent children, who understand that their strength must be preserved not for personal comfort, but for the continuation of small lives that depend entirely on their persistence. Elizabeth moves with the careful deliberation of someone whose body has been shaped by decades of repetitive labor. Her spine curves in the exact arc required by years of bending over washing tubs. Her shoulders have developed the muscular definition that comes from lifting wet clothes day after day, Her hands possess the specialized strength that allows her to wring water from heavy fabric with an efficiency that younger women cannot match. She rarely speaks, but her presence provides a steady anchor of experience for the others. A demonstration that survival is possible even when the body bears the permanent marks of hard work. The water numbs Mary's hands within minutes of beginning work, but she continues the rhythmic motion of scrubbing, rinsing, wringing out the clothes that represent not just cleanliness but respectability for the families who can afford such services. Each garment tells its own story. The merchant's shirt with its fine cotton that requires gentle handling. The farmer's work clothes, so stained with earth and sweat that they seem more brown than their original white. The child's dress with careful mends that speak of a mother's love expressed through needle and thread. The merchant's clothing speaks of a life lived indoors, of work performed at desks rather than in fields, of social interactions that require appearance to match status. His shirts made from cotton so fine that Mary must handle them with special care to avoid creating snags or tears. Bare stains that tell stories of spilled wine and rich food, of evenings spent in warm rooms where fire burns freely and food appears without regard to cost. These garments require gentle treatment, soap applied carefully, scrubbing performed with light pressure, wringing accomplished through patient coaxing rather than forceful twisting. The farmer's clothes present different challenges and tell different stories. His work shirts woven from coarse linen designed to withstand hard use, bear stains that speak of honest labor, mud from plowed fields, sweat from days spent under the sun, tears from contact with rough tools and thorny hedgerows. These garments can withstand more aggressive treatment, require stronger soap and harder scrubbing to achieve cleanliness. But they also reward Mary's efforts with visible results that provide their own satisfaction. The child's dress captures Mary's attention with its careful mends and alterations. Someone, undoubtedly the child's mother, has lengthened the hem with fabric that almost but doesn't quite match the original material. The sleeves have been taken in and let out again as the child grew, creating visible lines that mark the passage of time and the careful attention of someone who understands that children's clothes must serve for more than one season. These garments receive Mary's gentlest care, partly from practical necessity, but also from recognition of the love they represent. By midday, Mary's hands have lost most sensation, becoming tools that respond to will rather than feeling. She takes breaks to blow on her fingers, to hold them close to her body, where some warmth still lingers, but the work cannot wait for comfort. The clothes must be cleaned, wrung out, and loaded into the basket for the journey back through the village, to the houses where they will be hung near fires, and carefully tended until they dry. The loss of sensation in her hands creates its own dangers. Mary has learned to work by sight and pressure rather than touch, to recognize when fabric is clean by its appearance rather than its feel, to gauge the amount of force needed for wringing by watching the water flow, rather than feeling the resistance of wet cloth. This adaptation, born of necessity, transforms her relationship with her work from one of physical sensation to one of visual assessment and learned timing. During the brief pause, she allows herself for the cold meal. Mary sits on a stone beside the stream and observes the world with the particular attention of someone whose survival depends on noticing small changes in familiar patterns. She watches the way ice forms differently on moving water versus still pools, notes which trees lose their leaves first and which hold them longest, observes the behavior of the few birds that remain through winter rather than following warmer weather south. These observations, accumulated day by day throughout the seasons, create a personal encyclopedia of local knowledge that serves practical purposes beyond mere curiosity. Understanding how ice forms helps her predict which parts of the stream will be accessible for washing, even in the hardest weather. Knowing which trees provide the best windbreaks helps her choose routes that conserve energy during difficult journeys. Recognizing the signs that predict changes in weather allows her to plan work and provisioning accordingly. The winter of 1847 brought challenges that tested even Mary's practiced endurance. The snow began falling in early December and continued with brief interruptions until March. The stream, which had never frozen completely in living memory, developed ice thick enough to support a person's weight, forcing the washerwomen to break through to reach the flowing water beneath. The sound of their wooden paddles striking ice echoed through the valley like an irregular drumbeat, marking time to the rhythm of survival. The unusually severe weather created circumstances that no amount of experience had prepared the village to handle. Snow accumulated to depths that made travel dangerous even for those familiar with every path and landmark. The cold penetrated buildings constructed during warmer periods in the village's history, finding weaknesses in construction that had never before mattered. Food stored in root cellars froze solid despite being below ground level, creating shortages that no amount of careful rationing could entirely address. Mary found herself adapting her routines to accommodate conditions that fell outside the range of normal winter hardship. She learned to break ice not just for washing, but to access the stream for drinking water. As the village well froze to a depth that made drawing water impossible, she discovered which combinations of clothing provided adequate protection for extended periods outdoors, even when that meant wearing every garment she owned simultaneously. She developed techniques for maintaining fire with fuel sources that would normally be considered inadequate. Burning furniture when coal ran out, using paper and cloth when wood became unavailable. On the worst days, when the wind drove snow horizontally across the fields and made travel dangerous, Mary worked in her own cottage, mending clothes by the light of her single window, stretching thread and fabric to extend the useful life of garments that had already served far beyond their intended duration. These were quiet hours, filled with the soft sounds of needle passing through cloth. The occasional pop of the fire when a pocket of moisture in the wood met the flames. The work of mending requires different skills than washing, but demands equal precision and patience. Mary learned from her aunt the techniques of invisible repair. How to match thread color to fabric so perfectly that mended areas disappear. How to reinforce weak spots before they become actual tears. How to alter garments to accommodate changes in the wearer's body or circumstances. These skills passed down through generations of women who understood that clothing must last until replacement becomes possible rather than merely convenient, represent a form of art disguised as necessity. Her sewing supplies occupy a wooden box that once belonged to her grandmother, needles of different sizes for different types of fabric, thread in colors that match the most common clothing hues, scissors kept sharp through careful maintenance and limited use, a thimble worn smooth by decades of protecting fingers from needle pricks. Each tool serves multiple purposes and receives care proportional to its irreplaceable nature. Needles are stored in fabric to prevent rust and breakage. Thread is wound carefully to prevent tangling and waste. The scissors are used only for cutting fabric, never for other household tasks that might dull their precision. Her meals during these long months were studies in creative scarcity. Turnip soup made from vegetables that had grown soft and strange in storage, but which still provided sustenance when combined with water and the last bits of a ham bone that had already given up most of its flavor to previous meals. Bread made from flour stretched with ground acorns, creating loaves that were dense and slightly bitter, but which filled the empty spaces in her stomach. When eaten with the weak tea that served as her primary luxury, the turnips, stored since autumn harvests in the small root cellar beneath her cottage, represent the foundation of winter nutrition for people in Mary's circumstances. By February, these vegetables have lost much of their original firmness and sweetness, developing a texture that hovers between crisp and soft, a flavor that grows more pronounced and less pleasant with each passing week. Yet they provide essential nutrients in bulk that make the difference between hunger and starvation, between maintaining strength for work and gradually weakening toward incapacity. Mary learned to prepare turnips in ways that maximized their nutritional value while minimizing their less appealing qualities. Sliced thin and boiled with any available herbs, they create a soup that can be stretched with water and thickened with flour to provide multiple meals. Roasted in the dying coals of her fire, they develop a sweetness that makes them more palatable, while conserving fuel through efficient use of existing heat. Grated raw and mixed with the last of her stored apples, they create a side dish that provides variety in a diet necessarily limited to available ingredients. The ham bone, purchased during the previous autumn, when she could afford such luxuries, continues to provide value long after the original meat has been consumed. Each use in soup or stew extracts additional flavor and nutrients, creating the foundation for meals that provide more satisfaction than their simple ingredients might suggest. The bone itself will eventually be cracked open to access the marrow inside, or ground into powder that can be mixed with flour to add protein to bread. Nothing edible receives less than complete utilization. when survival depends on extracting maximum value from every resource. The isolation of living alone became more pronounced in winter, when social visits were curtailed by weather and the simple difficulty of traveling even short distances safely. Mary's conversations were limited to the few words exchanged with other washerwomen at the stream, the brief greetings when she delivered clean clothes to her customers, the occasional exchange with shopkeepers when she had coin enough to purchase necessities. Yet this isolation carries benefits alongside its difficulties. Mary has learned to find companionship in activities that require no other person's presence, reading by firelight, creating small handicrafts from scraps and remnants, maintaining the detailed mental records that track her resources and obligations. She has developed the ability to hold extended conversations with herself, working through problems and decisions with the thoroughness that might otherwise require discussion with friends or family members. The absence of constant social interaction has also taught Mary to pay closer attention to the non-human world that surrounds her cottage. She knows the habits of the birds that visit her small garden, recognizes the individual personalities of the village cats that sometimes shelter in her shed during storms, understands the seasonal patterns of local wildlife with the precision of someone whose daily routines intersect with natural cycles. This knowledge provides its own form of companionship, connecting her to systems and rhythms that extend beyond human society. Yet within this isolation, Mary found a form of peace that might have surprised those who pitied her solitary state. The cottage, small as it was, belonged entirely to her. She could rise and sleep according to her own rhythm, eat when hunger moved her, rather than when social convention demanded, spend her evenings in whatever pursuit brought her comfort. She had inherited her aunt's small collection of books, a Bible, a volume of poetry, and a cookbook that described meals she could never afford to prepare, but which she read with the pleasure others might find in adventure stories. The Bible, bound and leather-worn soft by handling, opens automatically to passages that previous readers found most meaningful. The margins contain notes written in her aunt's careful hand, observations and questions that reveal a thoughtful engagement with religious ideas. Mary finds comfort in these familiar stories and verses, not necessarily from their spiritual content, but from their role in connecting her to the broader human experience of seeking meaning in difficult circumstances. The poetry volume, containing works by authors whose names mean little to Mary, but whose words capture feelings she recognizes, provides a different kind of comfort. Reading these poems by firelight, she discovers that her own experiences of solitude, hardship, and small victories have been shared by others who found ways to express them in language more beautiful than her own daily thoughts. The act of reading becomes a form of conversation across time and circumstance, connecting her isolated life to the larger human community of those who have struggled and persisted. The cookbook, with its descriptions of elaborate meals requiring ingredients she has never seen and cooking techniques she cannot imagine implementing, serves as entertainment more than instruction. Mary reads these recipes as others might read fairy tales, enjoying the fantasy of abundance they represent while understanding that their practical application lies beyond her circumstances. That even these impossible menus contribute to her sense of connection to a world larger than her daily experience of scarcity and limitation. On Sundays, when even the most demanding customers allowed their washing to wait, Mary attended services at the village church, where the congregation huddled together in pews worn smooth by generations of worshippers. The church building, ancient even by Victorian standards, provided little protection from cold, but the shared warmth of bodies and voices created an atmosphere of community that sustained spirits through the darkest months. The church itself tells the story of the village's history through architectural details that span centuries. The original Norman foundation supports walls that have been rebuilt and modified by successive generations, each adding elements that reflect the building techniques and aesthetic preferences of their time. The result is a structure that seems to grow organically from the landscape, its stone walls weathered to match the local hillsides, its proportions reflecting the scale of human community rather than grand architectural ambition. Inside, the building maintains the particular atmosphere of spaces devoted to regular religious observance over extended periods. The wooden pews, carved from oak trees that grew in local forests generations ago, bear the polish that comes only from contact with countless bodies over many years. The stone floor, worn smooth in patterns that reveal the most common routes of movement, reflects the accumulated weight of ceremonial procession and daily worship. The air itself seems to hold echoes of previous services, creating an environment where current prayers join a continuing conversation that spans decades and centuries. The sermon on a particular Sunday in February focused on endurance, on the patience required to survive not just winter but life itself. The vicar, a thin man whose own cottage was only marginally warmer than those of his parishioners, spoke of seasons as spiritual metaphors, of cold as a test that strengthened character, of spring as a promised reward for faithful endurance. Mary listened, with the part of her attention not occupied by keeping her feet warm and her hands from trembling. Finding in the familiar words a comfort that had nothing to do with their theological content, and everything to do with their role in the ritual of community survival. The vicar's words reflect his own experience of hardship shared with his congregation, rather than observed from a position of comfort and security. His understanding of endurance comes not from abstract theological study, but from personal knowledge of what winter means for people whose survival depends on careful management of limited resources. When he speaks of patience, he addresses people who practice it daily through necessity rather than choice. When he promises eventual relief from current difficulties, he speaks to people who need that hope to maintain the strength required for continued survival. After church, she walked home through snow that creaked beneath her feet, past cottages where smoke rose from chimneys like prayers made visible against the gray sky. The afternoon stretched ahead, hours of solitude that she would fill with small tasks designed to maintain life rather than improve it. Mending a torn seam in her winter dress, preparing tomorrow's meal from ingredients that required imagination to transform into something nourishing, reading by the window while light lasted, then by candlelight when darkness claimed the day. The walk home provides Mary with her weekly opportunity to observe the village as a whole, to note changes in circumstances that might affect her own situation, to maintain her sense of connection to the community of which she forms a part despite her solitary living arrangements. She notices which cottages show signs of successful adaptation to winter hardship, and which reveal the struggles of their occupants. She observes the condition of gardens and outbuildings, the state of repair of roofs and walls, the presence or absence of smoke that indicates whether families can afford to maintain fires during daylight hours. These observations serve practical purposes beyond mere curiosity. Understanding which families prosper during difficult times helps Mary identify potential customers for her washing services. Recognizing which households face serious hardship allows her to avoid seeking payment when customers may be unable to provide it, preserving relationships that will become valuable again when circumstances improve. Noticing changes in the general condition of village life helps her anticipate whether demand for her services will increase or decrease in coming weeks. As evening approached, Mary would bank her fire with the careful attention of someone whose survival depended on making limited resources last exactly long enough. Too little fuel, and she would wake to a cottage so cold that ice would form in the water basin. Too much, and she might find herself without coal to maintain even minimal warmth later in the week. This calculation, performed daily by everyone in the village, represented a form of mathematics taught by necessity rather than schooling. The technique of banking fires to maintain heat through long periods while conserving fuel requires knowledge that comes only through experience and careful observation. Mary learned from her aunt how to arrange coals and ashes to create slow, steady combustion that produces maximum heat over extended time periods. She discovered which types of wood burn most efficiently for different purposes: quick-burning kindling for rapid heat when needed immediately, slow-burning hardwood for sustained warmth through cold nights, resinous pine for light when candles become too expensive to use regularly. The night sounds of winter surrounded her cottage: wind in the eaves, the occasional crack of wood adjusting to changing temperature, the distant sound of other villagers making their own preparations for sleep. Mary would lie in her narrow bed, feeling the cold gradually reclaim the spaces that fire had temporarily warmed, but also feeling the quiet satisfaction of having successfully completed another day of survival. These sounds, familiar through repetition, but never entirely predictable, create the audio landscape of winter solitude. Mary has learned to interpret them, distinguishing between wind that threatens damage and wind that simply announces changing weather. recognizing the different sounds that wood makes as it contracts at various rates, depending on temperature and moisture content. Identifying the distant human activities that indicate normal village life continuing despite difficult conditions. This acoustic awareness provides both practical information and emotional comfort, connecting her to the larger community of survival that includes all living things adapting to seasonal challenges. Her dreams, when they came, often featured warmth. Summer days when laundry dried quickly on lines stretched between trees, when her hands were soft instead of cracked, when food was abundant enough that she could eat for pleasure rather than mere sustenance. But even in dreams, she remained essentially herself, a woman who had learned to find dignity in necessary work, strength in solitude, and beauty in the small victories that marked each day's successful passage from dawn to dusk. The winter of 1847 eventually ended, as all winters do, but it left its mark on Mary, as it did on everyone who survived it. Her hands bore new scars from ice and harsh soap. Her constitution was tested by months of inadequate heat and marginal nutrition. Her spirit carried the particular fatigue that comes from extending endurance beyond its natural limits. Yet she had persisted, maintained her independence, continued the quiet work that made life possible not just for herself, but for the families whose cleanliness depended on her willingness to plunge her hands into freezing water day after day. Spring, when it finally arrived, brought work of a different kind. Heavier loads of washing as people emerged from winter's hibernation, but also the luxury of working beside water that did not require breaking through ice, of hanging clothes to dry in air that carried hints of growing things rather than just the bitter emptiness of deep cold. Mary met these changes with the same patient determination that had carried her through winter. Understanding that survival was not a single victory but a daily choice renewed with each morning's decision to rise, dress, and continue the essential work of living. The transformation from winter to spring occurs gradually, then suddenly, with changes that accumulate imperceptibly until one morning the world appears fundamentally altered. Mary noticed first the subtle shift in light quality, not brighter necessarily, but carrying undertones of warmth that had been absent for months. Then came changes in sound, the return of birds that had spent winter elsewhere. The different note of wind through trees beginning to show green buds, the altered rhythm of stream flow as ice melted and water volume increased. These seasonal changes brought their own adjustments to Mary's carefully established routines. The washing work became easier in some ways. No more breaking ice to reach running water. No more fighting numbness that threatened to make her drop valuable tools. No more struggling with clothes that froze before they could be properly wrung out. But spring also brought increased demand for her services. As families emerged from winter's enforced indoor life and discovered the accumulated evidence of months spent in close quarters with limited ability to maintain usual standards of cleanliness, Mary understood that her survival through the winter of 1847 represented not an ending, but a transition. One season's challenges replaced by another's different, but equally demanding requirements. She had learned once again that persistence, rather than dramatic triumph, provided the key to continued existence. Each day that she had awakened, dressed, performed necessary work, had contributed to the larger achievement of seeing another spring arrive. This knowledge earned through experience rather than taught through instruction would guide her approach to whatever challenges the coming seasons might bring. As night deepens around us, let us drift from the familiar rhythms of daily survival into something more mysterious. The hidden practices and forgotten beliefs that help Victorian villagers navigate not just the physical cold, but the spiritual darkness that winter brought to their small communities. For in those months, when the sun barely lifted above the horizon and frost painted strange patterns on every surface, people reached for comforts that existed somewhere between superstition and hope. These practices emerged from the collision between official Christian doctrine and older ways of understanding the world that refused to disappear entirely. No matter how thoroughly the church had claimed dominion over rural souls, in the liminal spaces between what was publicly acknowledged and what was privately believed, villagers constructed elaborate systems of protection that drew from sources far older than the Gothic churches that dominated their village squares. The need for such spiritual defenses grew more pressing as winter tightened its grip on communities already struggling with the physical challenges of survival. When rational preparation, storing food, gathering fuel, mending clothes, reached its limits, people turned to practices that addressed fears that logic could not entirely dispel. These were the fears that crept into minds during the long hours between sunset and dawn, when winds sounded like voices and shadows moved with purpose that seemed too deliberate for mere chance. Picture, if you will, the village of Little Wickham in the winter of 1851, where something peculiar was discovered when the blacksmith's apprentice went to clear snow from the churchyard path. Beneath 3 feet of pristine white, his shovel struck, not stone or frozen earth, but wood, carved wood, arranged in patterns that made no immediate sense to his young eyes. What he had found were the remnants of what the oldest villagers called winter wheels, wooden discs marked with symbols that seemed to dance in the flickering light of his lantern. The apprentice, a boy named Thomas Wickshire, whose family had moved to Little Wickham only 5 years earlier, had no context for understanding what his shovel had revealed. To his 17-year-old mind, shaped by the practical demands of working with iron and fire, the carved wooden discs seemed like children's toys abandoned in some long-ago game. But when he brought them to his master, the blacksmith's face grew pale in the forge light, and he instructed the boy to wrap the objects carefully and bring them to Mrs. Elderwood without delay. The blacksmith, Harold Ashworth, had spent 30 years in Little Wickham, long enough to hear whispers of the old practices, even if he had never witnessed them directly. His own father had spoken of such things, always in careful tones that suggested knowledge too dangerous to share openly. Harold understood that these carved wheels represented something that connected the village to its hidden history, something that deserved more respect than a young apprentice's casual curiosity could provide. These artifacts, buried and forgotten beneath decades of snow and neglect, whispered of practices that had persisted long after official Christianity had claimed the souls of England's rural communities. The wheels, each no larger than a dinner plate, bore carvings that spiraled inward toward centers, marked with 6-pointed stars. Some showed evidence of having been burned, their edges charred black, as if they had been passed through flame as part of some ritual whose purpose had been forgotten, even by those who once performed it. The wood itself told stories to those who knew how to read such signs. Oak cut during the waning moon, carved while the sap was dormant, aged by exposure to specific combinations of earth and moisture. The spiral patterns followed mathematical proportions that seemed too precise to be accidental, ratios that appeared in natural forms like nautilus shells and unfurling ferns, as if the carvers had intuited geometric principles that connected their protective symbols to deeper patterns in the natural world. Each wheel bore unique details that suggested individual craftsmanship rather than mass production. One showed tiny holes drilled at regular intervals around its circumference, perhaps once filled with colored stones or metal inlays. Another displayed scratches that might have been deliberate marks or accidental damage from use in ceremonies whose physical requirements could only be guessed at. A third bore stains that careful examination revealed to be traces of wax and some dark substance that could have been blood or plant dye. The discovery troubled the vicar, a learned man who had come to Little Wickham from Oxford with modern ideas about proper Christian practice. But it fascinated Mrs. Elderwood, whose family had lived in the village for 7 generations, and who remembered stories her grandmother had whispered about the old ways of surviving winter's darkest months. She spoke in the careful voice of someone sharing secrets, of rituals performed on the longest nights, when the boundary between the world of the living and whatever lay beyond seemed thin as frost on morning windows. Mrs. Elderwood's knowledge came not from books but from the careful transmission of oral tradition that had survived despite official disapproval. Her grandmother had been raised by a woman who claimed to remember the last of the winter wheel ceremonies, performed in secret during the harsh decade of the 1790s, when crop failures and political upheaval had driven villagers to seek protection through any means available. The stories had been passed down through 4 generations of women, each adding her own observations and interpretations, while preserving the essential details with the precision of those who understood they were maintaining something irreplaceable. According to these half-remembered tales, the winter wheels had been buried at the 4 corners of the village as protection against the malevolent spirits that were thought to ride the winter winds. Each wheel was carved during the brief daylight hours of December, when the sun hung low and pale in the southern sky, casting shadows that seemed longer and stranger than shadows had any right to be. The carving was done by the oldest woman in the village, her fingers moving in patterns passed down through generations. Of mothers who had learned to read meaning in the grain of wood and the direction of wind. The selection of the carver followed ancient precedents that no written law had ever codified, but which everyone understood with the certainty of unquestioned tradition. She must be past the age of bearing children, freed from the monthly cycles that connected her to the moon's changes and the earth's fertility. She must have witnessed at least 7 winters, demonstrating the survival knowledge that qualified her to create protection for others. She must possess hands steady enough to execute the precise geometric patterns that gave the wheels their power, and eyes sharp enough to work by the limited light of winter days. The wood for the wheels came from oak trees that had been struck by lightning, but survived. Their altered grain patterns believed to hold special properties that made them suitable for spiritual work. Such trees were rare and precious, marked by the villagers and carefully preserved until winter wheel ceremonies required their sacrifice. The cutting had to be done during specific lunar phases, with prayers spoken over the living tree before the first axe stroke, and offerings left to compensate the forest for the loss of one of its guardians. The ritual of burying the wheels took place on the winter solstice, when darkness held dominion over the world for the longest possible time. The entire village would gather in the church square, their breath creating clouds of vapor that mingled and rose like incense toward the star-scattered sky. One by one, the wheels were carried to their designated spots: north, south, east, and west, where holes had been dug in ground so hard with frost that the work required days of patient chipping with iron tools heated in the blacksmith's forge. The ceremony began at sunset, with the lighting of 4 bonfires arranged in a cross pattern within the church square. Each fire was built from wood that had been gathered according to its own specific requirements: ash for strength, hawthorn for protection, elder for wisdom, rowan for purity. The flames provided not just illumination for the evening's work, but also the spiritual cleansing that prepared the participants for their encounter with forces that ordinary daylight kept safely hidden. As the fires burned down to coals, the carved wheels would be passed among the gathered villagers, each person holding them briefly while making silent requests for protection through the coming months. Children too young to understand the ceremony's full meaning would touch the carved symbols with wondering fingers, absorbing through contact some portion of the community's faith in their protective power. Old people who remembered previous winter wheel ceremonies would run their hands over familiar patterns, checking that the new wheels maintained the traditional proportions and details that ensured their effectiveness. As each wheel was placed in its earthen resting place, the villagers would speak words that were old when their grandparents were children. Phrases in a dialect so ancient that their meaning had become more feeling than understanding. The words spoke of binding the harmful cold, casting boundaries that winter's worst spirits could not cross, of weaving protection around the vulnerable community like an invisible blanket made from intention and hope. These incantations had survived through centuries of linguistic change, preserving pronunciations and grammatical structures that belonged to earlier periods of English development. Modern scholars who have studied fragments of such ritual language find connections to Old Norse, Celtic, and even pre-Celtic linguistic elements that suggest the ceremonies drew from traditions far older than Christianity's arrival in Britain. The words themselves had become sacred through repetition rather than meaning, their power residing in their continuity rather than their comprehension. The burial sites for the wheels followed a geography that connected spiritual protection to physical landscape. The northern wheel, buried where the hill rose steepest above the village, faced the direction from which the worst winter storms typically arrived. The southern wheel, placed in the depression where summer streams gathered, guarded against the creeping cold that settled in low places during clear nights. The eastern and western wheels marked the boundaries of cultivated land, protecting the fields where next year's survival would be grown and harvested. But the mystery of the winter wheels was only one thread in the complex tapestry of beliefs that helped Victorian villagers endure their darkest months. In cottages throughout the village, above doorways and windows, small bundles hung from nails driven into ancient wooden beams. These were frost charms, carefully assembled collections of herbs, stones, and metals that were believed to ward off the killing cold that could creep through even the smallest gaps. The creation of frost charms followed patterns that varied from household to household, while maintaining underlying similarities that revealed their common origins. Each charm began with a foundation of materials that represented the elements essential to winter survival. Iron for strength, salt for purity, grain for sustenance, cloth for warmth. To these basic components, individual families would add items that reflected their particular vulnerabilities and hopes. Each charm was unique, reflecting the particular fears and hopes of the household it protected. A family with young children might include rowan berries, thought to protect against the fever that struck so suddenly in winter's grip. A cottage where an elderly person lived alone might hold iron filings from the blacksmith's floor, metal that was said to confuse the spirits that sought out the weak and isolated. A household that depended on livestock for survival would wrap their charm around a small piece of wool, asking for protection of the animals whose milk and warmth made human life possible. The rowan berries, gathered during the brief period in autumn when they reached perfect ripeness, required careful preparation before they could serve in protective charms. They had to be picked during daylight hours by someone who approached the tree with proper respect, speaking words of gratitude to the plant before taking its fruit. The berries were then dried in patterns that preserved not just their physical substance, but their spiritual potency. Spread in circles on wooden trays, turned at intervals that followed the sun's path across the sky, stored in containers that had never held food or been used for mundane purposes. Iron filings presented their own complex requirements for proper collection and preparation. Not all iron possessed equal protective power. The metal had to come from tools that had been used for beneficial purposes, from horseshoes that had carried riders safely, from plowshares that had opened earth for successful crops. The blacksmith understood which scraps and filings carried the proper spiritual charge, setting aside materials throughout the year for the autumn charm-making season when demand for such elements reached its peak. Wool for protective purposes came with its own restrictions and requirements. It had to be taken from sheep that had survived at least one complete winter, demonstrating their fitness to provide protection against cold. Your shearing had to be done gently, without causing fear or pain that might contaminate the wool with negative influences. Most importantly, the wool had to be given freely rather than purchased, creating a bond between the charm maker and the source of protection that mere commercial transaction could not provide. The creation of these charms followed its own seasonal rhythm, beginning in late autumn when the first hard frost warned of winter's approach. Women would gather in kitchen corners or by dying garden plots, sharing knowledge that had never been written down, never been approved by church authorities, but had survived through centuries of whispered instruction and careful observation of what seemed to work and what did not. These gatherings represented one of the few opportunities for women to exercise traditional knowledge that existed outside male-dominated institutions. The creation of protective charms was women's work not because men were forbidden to participate, but because women were considered to possess particular sensitivity to the spiritual influences that threatened domestic security. Their daily responsibility for maintaining household harmony and protecting family members from harm gave them expertise in recognizing the subtle signs that indicated when supernatural protection might be needed. The knowledge shared in these sessions extended far beyond the simple assembly of protective objects. Women discussed the timing of various spiritual practices, the interpretation of signs that might indicate supernatural threats, the proper responses to phenomena that rational explanation could not address. They shared observations about which combinations of materials seemed most effective, which prayers or incantations produced the best results, which household members might be particularly vulnerable to winter's spiritual dangers. Mary Hartwell, whose solitary winter we have already witnessed, kept her own collection of protective items, though she would have been mortified to have them called superstitions. Above her cottage door hung a small iron horseshoe, its open end pointing upward to catch and hold whatever luck might fall from winter skies. The horseshoe had belonged to her aunt, and before that to her aunt's mother, each woman adding her own silent prayers to the metal's protective power. The horseshoe's history could be traced through 3 generations of women who had lived alone and survived circumstances that might have overwhelmed those with less spiritual preparation. Mary's Grattan had acquired it during the terrible winter of 1814, when snow fell continuously for 6 weeks, and several village families had been found frozen in their cottages. Her aunt had carried it through the cholera outbreak of 1832, when supernatural as well as natural explanations for the disease seemed equally plausible. Mary herself had inherited both the physical object and the accumulated faith of the women who had trusted their survival to its protection. The positioning of the horseshoe followed specific requirements that Mary had learned through careful observation rather than explicit instruction. It hung exactly 7 inches above the door lintel, high enough to be touched by anyone entering, but not so high as to be forgotten in daily passage. The nail that held it had been driven during a waxing moon, when protective influences grew stronger rather than weaker. The horseshoe faced inward toward the cottage's interior, drawing beneficial influences inside, while blocking harmful ones from entering. Inside the cottage, tucked behind the wooden cross that marked her Christian faith, Mary kept a small cloth bag filled with salt that had been blessed not by the vicar but by old Margaret, the herb woman who lived at the village's edge and who was consulted when official medicine failed to heal winter's wounds. The salt was said to absorb harmful influences from the air, growing heavier with accumulated malevolence until it needed to be replaced with fresh crystals and the old salt buried far from any dwelling. Old Margaret occupied a position in village society that existed entirely outside official recognition, but commanded respect that formal authority could not match. She was the keeper of knowledge that predated Christian conversion, the practitioner of healing arts that worked whether or not their theoretical basis could be explained in terms that educated men would accept. Her cottage, set apart from the village proper, served as a repository for beliefs and practices that the community needed but could not publicly acknowledge. The salt blessing ritual performed by old Margaret involved procedures that connected Christian symbolism with older traditions of purification and protection. The salt was spread in patterns that resembled crosses, but incorporated additional geometric elements that belonged to pre-Christian protective systems. Prayers were spoken that combined Latin phrases from church liturgy with invocations in the old dialect that preserved ancient names for protective spirits. The blessing took place during the dark of the moon, when harmful influences were thought to be weakest and beneficial ones most easily strengthened. The preparation of blessed salt required materials gathered according to strict protocols that ensured their spiritual purity. The salt itself had to come from sources that had never been contaminated by commercial use, ideally from deposits found in caves where it had formed naturally over centuries, or from evaporation of seawater collected during storms when the ocean's spiritual power reached its peak. The cloth bag that would hold the salt was woven from flax grown in local fields, spun by unmarried women, sewn with thread that had never been used for mundane purposes. These practices existed in the shadows of acknowledged religion, neither fully accepted nor entirely rejected by communities that needed every possible protection against winter's assault. The vicar might frown upon such pagan remnants, but he did not forbid them outright, understanding perhaps that faith took many forms when survival hung in the balance between warmth and cold, life and death. The relationship between official Christianity and traditional protective practices created tensions that different communities resolved in different ways. Some vicars actively opposed any spiritual activity that occurred outside church authority, preaching sermons that condemned folk practices as dangerous superstitions that endangered souls as well as bodies. Others adopted a more tolerant approach, recognizing that their parishioners' survival often depended on sources of comfort and strength that formal religion could not always provide. In Little Wickham, Reverend Dr. Whitmore represented the educated Anglican establishment's ambivalent attitude toward traditional beliefs. His Oxford training had taught him to dismiss such practices as remnants of pre-Christian ignorance that proper instruction would gradually eliminate. But his 5 years of pastoral service in rural communities had shown him that dismissing beliefs that provided genuine comfort to struggling people often created more problems than it solved. His compromised position involved neither endorsing nor condemning traditional practices, while emphasizing that Christian faith provided superior protection for those wise enough to rely upon it completely. This delicate balance allowed village practices to continue, while maintaining the fiction that they represented individual eccentricity rather than community tradition. Villagers could maintain their protective rituals while attending church services, participating in Christian ceremonies while privately acknowledging spiritual forces that official doctrine did not recognize. The result was a complex religious landscape where multiple belief systems coexisted uneasily but functionally, each providing elements that the others lacked. Archaeological evidence of these winter beliefs continues to surface even today. When construction projects or agricultural work disturbs ground that has lain undisturbed since Victorian times, in 1987, workers expanding a school in what had once been Little Wickham discovered a cache of objects buried beneath the playground. Carved bone discs, bundles of herbs preserved by some accident of soil chemistry, small iron tokens bearing symbols that no living person could interpret. The archaeological discovery created excitement among scholars who specialized in folk, religion, and traditional practices. Here was physical evidence of beliefs that had previously existed only in scattered references in church records, court documents, and the collected folklore of Victorian antiquarians. The objects provided concrete proof that traditional practices had survived far longer and in more elaborate forms than academic historians had previously recognized. The bones had been carved with spirals and dots, patterns that seemed to shift and move when viewed by lamplight, creating optical illusions that might have been intentional elements of their original purpose. Some bore traces of red pigment, ochre mixed with animal blood perhaps, or the juice of berries gathered in autumn's final days. The preservation was so complete that the carving marks were still visible, showing the careful work of hands that had shaped these objects with reverence and desperate hope. Analysis of the carved bones revealed sophisticated understanding of mathematical principles that created patterns pleasing to the eye while serving symbolic purposes that scholars could only guess at. The spirals followed proportions found in natural forms like shell chambers and flower petals, suggesting that the carvers understood principles of growth and harmony that connected their protective objects to larger patterns in the natural world. The dots appeared random at first glance, but closer examination revealed they were positioned according to astronomical observations, marking the positions of stars and planets that held particular significance for winter ceremonies. The red pigment proved to be a mixture of ochre, berry juice, and what chemical analysis identified as human blood, not evidence of sinister practices. But the common folk belief that objects designed to protect human life should incorporate some element of the life they were meant to preserve. The blood had been mixed with other substances in proportions that suggested knowledge of how different materials combined to create compounds that would remain stable over long periods of underground storage. One particular disc, larger than the others and more elaborately decorated, showed signs of having been handled repeatedly, its edges worn smooth by fingers that had traced its patterns in moments of fear or uncertainty. The central design depicted a tree whose branches reached toward 12 small circles, possibly representing the months of the year, with special emphasis given to the 3 circles that might have symbolized winter's darkest months. This master disc appeared to be the centerpiece of whatever ceremony had originally used the collection, the focus of attention during rituals that involved all the smaller objects found with it. The tree design incorporated elements that connected it to both Christian and pre-Christian symbolism. A trunk that resembled a cross, but branches that spread in patterns more reminiscent of Celtic tree worship than biblical imagery. The 12 circles matched the number of Christ's apostles, but also corresponded to lunar months and seasonal divisions that predated Christianity by centuries. The wear patterns on this central disc told their own story of use and reverence. Certain areas showed more handling than others, suggesting that the ritual use involved touching specific symbols at designated moments in the ceremony. The smooth areas corresponded to portions of the design that held particular significance. The tree trunk, the winter circles, specific branch intersections that might have represented critical moments in the annual cycle of death and renewal. The herbs found with the bone discs included varieties that still grew in the area: dried lavender for peace, rosemary for protection, vervain for warding off evil influences. But there were also plants that were no longer common in England, specimens of mountain ash from distant forests, Mediterranean sage that must have been traded across great distances, roots from plants that may have been extinct since medieval times. The effort required to assemble such a collection spoke of beliefs so powerful that people would travel great distances or pay precious coin to obtain the materials their protection rituals required. The presence of exotic herbs in a rural English burial suggested trade networks that connected traditional practitioners across vast distances, sharing knowledge and materials that formal institutions never recognized or documented. Mediterranean sage implied contact with practitioners in southern Europe who understood its protective properties and were willing to export it to northern communities. Mountain ash from distant forests meant that someone had traveled far from home to gather materials that local varieties could not provide, or had established relationships with travelers who could obtain such substances on their behalf. The preservation of roots from extinct plants raised questions about how long the traditional practices had continued and how carefully practitioners had maintained stocks of essential materials. If these roots came from plants that had disappeared from England during medieval times, their presence in a Victorian-era burial suggested that protective materials could be preserved for centuries, when their spiritual value justified the effort required to maintain them properly. Modern scholars who study these findings struggle to separate genuine historical practice from folklore that has grown more elaborate with each telling. The truth, they suggest, likely lies somewhere between the dismissive explanations of rational historians and the dramatic narratives of those who see profound pagan wisdom in every mysterious artifact. What remains undeniable is that Victorian villagers lived with a sense of winter as something more than mere weather, a force that required not just physical preparation, but spiritual defense. The academic debate over these discoveries reflects broader tensions between materialist and spiritual interpretations of historical evidence. Skeptical scholars argue that the objects represent nothing more than individual eccentricity, isolated examples of superstitious behavior that hold no broader significance for understanding Victorian rural culture. Others contend that the sophistication and consistency of the discovered items indicate systematic belief systems that deserve serious study rather than dismissive explanation. Archaeological methodology itself becomes controversial when dealing with artifacts that seem to transcend purely material significance. Standard techniques for dating, classifying, and interpreting physical remains work well for objects whose purpose and meaning can be understood through functional analysis. But protective charms and ritual objects resist purely material interpretation, requiring scholars to engage with spiritual and symbolic dimensions that make many academics uncomfortable. The long nights of winter provided fertile ground for beliefs that daylight might have discouraged. When sunset came at 4 in the afternoon and dawn waited until nearly 8 the next morning, when the wind howled around cottage corners with sounds that seemed almost like voices, when ice formed patterns on windows that looked deliberately crafted rather than randomly created, it became easier to believe that the natural world held intentions that were not always friendly to human survival. These extended periods of darkness created psychological conditions that modern people, accustomed to electric lighting and heated buildings, find difficult to imagine. The complete blackness that settled over rural communities at sunset was absolute in ways that contemporary urban dwellers never experience. No streetlights, illuminated pathways, no illuminated windows provided reassuring evidence of human presence. No distant glow suggested that civilization continued to exist beyond the immediate circle of firelight that defined each cottage's boundaries. Within this encompassing darkness, every sound became magnified and potentially significant. Wind that passed through bare tree branches created howls and whispers that could easily be interpreted as supernatural communication. Ice forming on structures produced sudden cracks and pops that might indicate the presence of beings moving through the night. Even familiar domestic sounds, the settling of roof beams, the movement of animals in their shelters, the hiss and sputter of dying fires, took on ominous qualities when heard from within the vulnerable isolation of a cottage surrounded by impenetrable night. The visual phenomena of winter darkness added to the sense that natural laws might be suspended during the coldest months. Ice formations on windows created patterns that resembled deliberate artwork rather than random crystallization. Frost-covered surfaces with designs that seemed too intricate and purposeful to result from mere atmospheric conditions. Snow drifted into shapes that suggested intentional sculpture rather than wind-driven accumulation, creating forms that disappeared with daylight but returned each night in variations that implied conscious design. In these extended hours of darkness, villagers reported phenomena that they struggled to explain through conventional understanding. Lights that moved across snow-covered fields with no apparent source, following paths that made sense to no human logic. Sounds that seemed to come from beneath the frozen ground, tapping, scratching. Sometimes what might have been muffled voices speaking in languages that belonged to no living community. The moving lights became a particular source of fascination and fear for Victorian villagers. These phenomena, which modern observers might explain as electrical discharges, reflected moonlight, or optical illusions created by extreme cold, seemed to demonstrate purpose and intelligence that made them appear supernatural rather than natural. The lights followed regular routes that connected significant locations in the village landscape. The church, the cemetery, the sites where winter wheels had been buried, the cottages of people who had died during previous cold seasons. Witnesses described lights that moved in formations suggesting group behavior that paused at locations of particular significance, responded to human observation by changing direction or intensity. Some villagers reported that the lights seemed to investigate their cottages, circling buildings as if searching for entry points, lingering at windows as if attempting to peer inside. Others claimed the phenomena were benevolent, providing illumination that helped lost travelers find their way home during blizzards, when normal navigation became impossible. The sounds from beneath the frozen ground proved equally mysterious and disturbing. Villagers reported hearing tapping that followed rhythmic patterns, suggesting intentional communication rather than random settling or expansion of frozen materials. The scratching sounds seemed to move along underground paths that connected one part of the village to another, as if something traveled through tunnel systems that no human had ever discovered or created. Most unsettling were the voices that some claimed to hear during the quietest nights, when snow muffled all surface sounds and the world seemed suspended in unnatural silence. These voices spoke in whispers that carried farther than normal speech, using words that sounded almost familiar but belonged to no dialect that living villagers could identify. The content of these communications remained tantalizingly unclear. Sometimes they seemed to be calling names of people who had died in previous winters. Sometimes they appeared to be giving warnings about dangers that had not yet manifested. Mrs. Elderwood, keeper of the village's oldest memories, spoke of the winter watchers, figures glimpsed at the edges of vision during the deepest cold, human in shape, but wrong in some essential way that made observers reluctant to look directly at them. These beings, she claimed, were drawn to houses where the warmth was weakest, where illness had taken hold, where despair had begun to replace hope. They could be discouraged by the proper charms, confused by iron placed across thresholds, turned away by salt scattered in careful patterns around cottage foundations. The winter watchers represented the most complex and troubling element of traditional winter beliefs. Unlike the protective practices that gave villagers active measures to take against supernatural threats, the Watchers suggested that some spiritual dangers might be too powerful for human defense. They were described as persistent and patient, returning night after night to observe households that caught their attention, waiting for opportunities that proper vigilance could delay but never entirely prevent. Mrs. Elderwood's descriptions of these entities emphasized their liminal quality. They appeared human enough to be recognizable as former people, but altered in ways that made their humanity questionable. They stood too still for too long. They moved in ways that seemed to ignore normal physical constraints. They observed human activities with attention that felt predatory rather than merely curious. Most disturbing, they seemed to possess knowledge about the people they watched, appearing at moments when families faced particular vulnerabilities, or making approaches that exploited specific fears or weaknesses. The protective measures recommended for dealing with winter watchers required community cooperation as well as individual vigilance. Iron placed across thresholds had to be positioned according to traditional patterns. That only the oldest villagers remembered completely. Salt scattered around cottage foundations needed to be renewed at specific intervals and applied in geometric patterns that created barriers the watchers could not cross. Most importantly, households had to maintain spiritual as well as physical warmth. Despair and hopelessness seemed to attract the watchers' attention more than mere physical discomfort. Whether these phenomena had any reality beyond the desperate imagination of people pushed to their limits by cold and isolation remains a question that each listener must answer for themselves. What matters for our purposes is that these beliefs provided psychological comfort to communities facing challenges that sometimes exceeded their physical resources to overcome. The rituals gave people actions to take when action seemed impossible, control to exercise when most of their lives was controlled by forces beyond their influence. The psychological benefits of traditional winter practices extended beyond simple comfort or reassurance. The elaborate preparation required for protective ceremonies, gave communities shared activities that strengthened social bonds during months when isolation threatened to break down cooperative relationships. The creation of charms and protective objects provided opportunities for older community members to pass essential knowledge to younger generations, ensuring that hard-won survival wisdom would not disappear with the deaths of those who had learned it through experience. The belief that supernatural protection could be obtained through proper ritual activity gave people hope that their survival was not entirely dependent on factors beyond their control. While they could not command the weather, ensure adequate food supplies, or prevent the diseases that struck suddenly during winter's worst periods, they could take spiritual measures that might influence the outcome of circumstances that reason suggested were hopeless. The mystery deepens when we consider that similar practices appeared in Victorian communities across England, Wales, and Scotland, with variations that seemed to reflect local conditions but underlying similarities that suggested common roots. Villages separated by hundreds of miles and with no known communication developed winter protection rituals that shared remarkable details. The use of specific geometric patterns, the emphasis on placing protective objects at the cardinal directions, the timing of ceremonies to coincide with the darkest nights of the year. This geographical distribution of similar practices raises fascinating questions about how traditional knowledge spread through populations that had limited contact with distant communities. The consistency of certain ritual elements across wide areas and among groups with no documented communication suggests either ancient common origins that had been preserved despite centuries of cultural change, or universal human responses to winter's challenges that emerged independently when communities faced similar survival pressures. The geometric patterns that appeared in protective objects from different regions showed mathematical relationships that implied sophisticated understanding of principles that formal education did not teach to rural populations. The emphasis on cardinal directions reflected astronomical knowledge that required careful observation of celestial movements over extended periods. The timing of ceremonies according to solstices and lunar phases indicated calendrical precision that had somehow been maintained without written records or institutional support. This consistency across distance and isolation implies either a common origin lost to history or a human response to winter's challenges that emerges naturally when survival depends on finding meaning and control within circumstances that offer little of either. The Victorian villagers who carved their wooden wheels and hung their frost charms were participating in a tradition that connected them not just to their own ancestors, but to every human community that had ever faced winter with insufficient resources and excessive vulnerability. As spring finally arrived and daylight began to reclaim the world from winter's dominion, many of these protective objects would be carefully stored away for the next year's use, while others would be buried or burned in rituals of gratitude for survival and hope for easier seasons ahead. The winter wheels would remain in their earthen resting places, their carved symbols slowly weathering under soil and moisture until curious shovels might discover them decades or centuries later, raising new questions about the hidden spiritual lives of people whose official records mentioned only births, deaths, and the practical business of staying alive. The seasonal transition from winter protection to spring renewal followed its own ritual calendar that marked the psychological as well as physical end of the cold season's dangers. Some protective objects were designed to be temporary, their power consumed through the winter months until spring's arrival left them empty of protective force. Others were intended for long-term use, their power recharged through exposure to spring sunshine and renewed through contact with the growing energies of the natural world's awakening. The disposal of used protective materials required as much care as their creation, since objects that had absorbed harmful influences throughout the winter months needed to be neutralized before they could be safely discarded. Burning released accumulated negative forces safely into the air, where they could disperse without affecting human communities. Burial in specific locations allowed the earth to absorb and transform harmful influences into neutral substances that posed no continuing threat. Tonight, as we rest in our heated homes with electric lights to banish darkness and insulated walls to hold back cold, we might pause to consider these forgotten practices with something more than simple dismissal. For in their careful attention to protection, their patient creation of meaning within hardship, their refusal to accept that physical preparation was sufficient for spiritual survival, The Victorian villagers demonstrated wisdom that transcends the specific beliefs that gave it expression. The mysteries they left buried in frozen ground speak not just of superstition, but of the human need to find agency within powerlessness. Community within isolation, hope within circumstances that logic would suggest should produce only despair. Their winter wheels and frost charms were technologies of survival as real and necessary as their coal fires and woolen clothing. Tools for protecting not just their bodies but their spirits through seasons that tested both with relentless, indifferent severity. In recognizing these practices as sophisticated responses to genuine challenges rather than mere primitive ignorance, we might discover that the boundary between rational and irrational survival strategies is less clear than modern assumptions suggest. The Victorian villagers who created elaborate spiritual defenses against winter's assault were not abandoning reason, but extending it into realms where purely material solutions proved insufficient. Their legacy lies not in the specific beliefs that governed their protective rituals, but in their understanding that human survival requires more than physical resources, that the maintenance of hope, meaning, and community bonds represents essential work that must continue even when all other work becomes impossible. As our journey through winter's forgotten corners nears its gentle conclusion, let us turn our attention to those who experienced the same brutal season from behind walls thick enough to muffle wind and windows large enough to transform frost into decorative art. For while Mary Hartwell counted pieces of coal and village women carved protective charms from desperation, another world existed, parallel but separate, where winter became not a test of survival, but an elaborate performance of comfort made visible. Imagine, if you will, Thornfield Manor. Nestled in the same valley where our village struggles, but elevated both literally and figuratively above the daily arithmetic of fuel and food. The manor sits on a gentle rise, its Georgian windows glowing warm yellow against the snow-laden landscape like benevolent eyes watching over the smaller dwellings scattered below. From those windows, on clear winter mornings, one can see the thin threads of smoke rising from village chimneys, though the distance makes them appear decorative rather than desperate, pleasant reminders of pastoral life rather than signals of survival. Lady Catherine Thornfield wakes not to the sharp bite of unheated air, but to the gentle warmth of a bedroom where fires have been tended since 4 a.m. by servants who rise in darkness to ensure that their mistress never experiences the shock of cold floors or frosted window panes. Her morning begins with hot chocolate brought on a silver tray, the cup warming her hands while steam carries the rich scent of imported cocoa beans, a luxury that would represent a month's wages for any of the washerwomen working by the frozen stream below. The ritual of Lady Catherine's winter morning unfolds with the precision of a ballet, each movement choreographed by decades of social expectation and enabled by wealth that insulates her from winter's inconveniences, while paradoxically making her more aware of its aesthetic possibilities. Her lady's maid Jenkins appears with armloads of clothing designed not just for warmth, but for the complex visual language of Victorian respectability, a of silk and wool, velvet and lace, each piece contributing to a costume that will allow her to move through the day as both participant in and observer of winter's theater. The dressing process itself becomes a meditation on the distance between survival and ceremony. Where village women pull on the same worn garments day after day, Lady Catherine chooses between multiple options for each layer. Chemise of fine lawn cotton warmed by the fire, stays laced with silk ribbon petticoats that rustle with the sound of prosperity. The corset that shapes her figure requires Jenkins's assistance, the two women working together in a dance of hooks and laces that transforms Lady Catherine's natural form into the idealized silhouette that society demands. Her morning dress, chosen from a wardrobe that contains more clothing than the entire village of Little Wickham collectively owns, reflects winter's influence through rich colors that echo the season, deep burgundy wool that mirrors wine mulled with spices, forest green velvet that captures the darkness of evergreen boughs heavy with snow. The fabric itself tells stories of trade routes that span continents, silkworms in distant China and sheep in Scottish highlands, all contributing to a garment that exists as much to demonstrate wealth as to provide warmth. Breakfast arrives in the morning room, where tall windows frame views of grounds transformed by snow into something resembling the romantic landscapes that hang in gilt frames throughout the manor. The meal itself represents abundance made visible. Eggs still warm from the manor's own henhouse. Cream so thick it holds the marks of the silver spoon. Jam made from strawberries preserved at summer's height and now released to brighten winter's pale monotony. Bread baked fresh that morning, its crust crackling as Lady Catherine breaks it, releases steam that carries the warmth of ovens that never go cold. The morning's correspondence arrives with breakfast. Letters from friends scattered across England's great houses, sharing news of the social season that continues even in winter's depths. Lady Margaret writes from her estate in Yorkshire, describing the elaborate preparations for her daughter's wedding, planned for February, despite the cold because the timing suits the groom's military leave. The Honourable Mrs. Fitzwilliam reports from London on the current fashion for winter entertainments. Elaborate dinner parties where guests arrive, bundled in furs and leave, glowing with warmth and wine, their carriages creating processions of light through dark city streets. These letters create a network of shared experience that exists entirely apart from the struggles of common folk. A social world where winter's challenges become opportunities for display rather than tests of endurance. Lady Catherine reads of ice skating parties on frozen lakes, where servants build bonfires along the shores to warm guests who glide across surfaces that village children would never dare approach for fear of breaking through thin ice. She learns of hunting parties that venture out in temperatures that would keep working people huddled by their fires. The hunter's pleasure enhanced rather than diminished by the difficulty of tracking game through deep snow. The differences extend beyond mere comfort to encompass entirely different relationships with winter's fundamental realities, where village families calculate fuel to last precise numbers of hours. The manor's fireplaces consume wood and coal with generous abandon, fires maintained in rooms that may not be occupied for days, simply to ensure that every space remains ready for potential use. The sound of servants carrying coal scuttles up and down stairs creates a constant background rhythm, the music of labor that makes leisure possible. Lady Catherine's daily routine unfolds within spaces designed to showcase winter's beauty while eliminating its discomfort. The library, where she spends morning hours reading or attending to correspondence, overlooks gardens where snow has transformed ordinary shrubs into sculptural arrangements that seem deliberately placed for aesthetic effect. The glass conservatory, heated by an elaborate system of pipes and flues, maintains temperatures that allow exotic plants to flourish even as frost decorates the windows with patterns that would enchant artists and poets. The conservatory represents perhaps the ultimate expression of wealth's ability to suspend natural law. Here, surrounded by orchids from tropical forests and ferns from temperate rainforests, Lady Catherine can experience perpetual spring while winter rages beyond the glass walls. The air carries the humid warmth of greenhouse conditions, the scent of growing things and rich soil, creating an environment so removed from seasonal reality that visitors often express surprise when they remember the snow-covered world that waits outside. Luncheon brings its own rituals of abundance, served in a dining room where portraits of previous generations of Thornfields gaze down from walls, warmed by fires that have burned continuously since October. The meal features ingredients that represent triumph over winter's limitations: oranges from Mediterranean groves, shipped north at considerable expense to provide vitamin and brightness during England's grey months. Oysters brought by rapid coach from coastal waters, still tasting of sea spray and summer tides. Wine from cellars where bottles rest at carefully controlled temperatures, protected from frost by the same stone walls that have sheltered the family for 2 centuries. The afternoon might bring visitors, other members of the local gentry who venture out in carriages equipped with heated bricks and fur rugs, their horses' breath creating clouds of steam as they traverse country lanes that would be impassable for anyone traveling on foot. These social calls become exercises in competitive comfort, each household striving to provide warmer rooms, richer refreshments, more elaborate demonstrations of winter, transformed from hardship into hospitality. Lady Catherine receives her guests in the drawing room, where fire screens decorated with needlepoint protect delicate complexions from direct heat, while allowing the full benefit of warmth to circulate. The conversation flows over topics that would seem surreal to villagers struggling with survival. London modiste has created the most flattering winter styles. Whether the new fashion for darker colors is more becoming than the traditional pale tones, how to manage the logistics of house parties when travel is complicated by snow and ice, The tea service itself becomes a performance of refinement. Silver vessels polished to mirror brightness, reflecting firelight and candlelight to create an atmosphere of liquid warmth. The tea, imported from estates in Ceylon and India, carries flavors that speak of distant summer heat, while delicate cakes and sandwiches provide sustenance that is entirely about pleasure rather than survival. Each sip, each small bite represents abundance so complete that scarcity becomes literally unimaginable. Yet even within this insulated world, winter asserts its presence in ways that money cannot entirely eliminate. Lady Catherine's letters mention the inconvenience of cancelled social engagements. When roads become truly impassable, worry that follows reports of particularly severe storms, the subtle anxiety that underlies even the most comfortable existence, when natural forces demonstrate their indifference to human wealth and position. The servants who make this comfort possible move through their own version of winter survival, though one cushioned by steady employment and adequate food. They rise before dawn to light fires, their own rooms unheated until the family's needs have been met. They venture out in all weather to maintain the routines that preserve the illusion of endless summer within the manor's walls. Their hands grow red and chapped from carrying water for washing and cooking. Their feet grow cold from walking corridors that never quite lose winter's chill despite the fires that warm the main rooms. Mrs. Harrington, the housekeeper, oversees this domestic orchestra with the skill of someone who understands that comfort is not natural but constructed, requiring constant attention to details that the family need never consider. The coordination required to ensure that hot water arrives precisely when needed, that fires are replenished before they die to embers, that rooms are warm before they are occupied, represents a form of military precision applied to the peaceful conquest of seasonal discomfort. The kitchen staff work in spaces that alternate between extremes. Ovens blazing hot for bread and roasts, sculleries cold enough that washing water must be heated continuously to prevent freezing. The cook, Mrs. Patterson, plans meals that demonstrate abundance while managing stores that must last through months when fresh supplies may be interrupted by weather. Her domain represents a compromise between the upper world of effortless plenty and the lower reality of careful resource management. Evening brings its own elaborate rituals of warmth and light. Dinner, served at the fashionable hour of 8, transforms the dining room into a stage where winter becomes backdrop rather than adversary. Candles multiply firelight into an almost magical illumination, their flames reflecting from crystal and silver to create an atmosphere of celebration that exists. Independent of any particular occasion worth celebrating, the meal itself unfolds over courses that would feed a village family for a week: soup enriched with cream and wine, fish brought from London markets at considerable expense, roasts accompanied by vegetables that have been carefully stored since autumn or grown in the manor's own forcing houses. Each dish represents victory over seasonal limitation, proof that wealth can extend summer's abundance through winter's scarcity. After dinner, when the ladies retire to the drawing room and the gentlemen remain with their port and cigars, conversation turns to topics that illuminate the strange isolation of extreme comfort. Plans for travel to warmer climates, Italy or the south of France, where winter becomes something observed from a distance rather than endured. Discussion of investments and property, the management of wealth that grows even during the season. When common folk struggle to maintain life at its most basic level, the drawing room, warmed by fires and candlelight, insulated by heavy curtains and thick carpets, becomes a space where winter exists only as aesthetic enhancement. Frost patterns on windows that sparkle like jewelry. Snow-covered grounds visible through glass that transforms the landscape into living painting. Lady Catherine and her guests speak of winter's beauty with a detachment of those who need never fear its power, finding poetry in scenes that would represent terror to anyone who might be forced to spend a night unsheltered in the elements they admire. Yet even in this cocoon of comfort, shadows of winter's darker reality occasionally intrude. Reports reach the manor of families found frozen in their cottages, of workers who failed to return from journeys through sudden storms, of children who succumbed to fevers that proper heating might have prevented. These stories are received with appropriate expressions of sympathy and charitable concern, but they exist in a different universe from the immediate experience of those who hear them. Lady Catherine's response to such reports often takes the form of organized charity. Baskets of food distributed to deserving families, Coal provided to the most desperate cases, funds contributed to parish relief efforts. These gestures represent genuine compassion, but they also serve to reinforce the distance between giver and recipient, emphasizing the gulf between those who experience winter as inconvenience and those who face it as potential destroyer. The charity itself becomes another form of winter entertainment, an opportunity for moral satisfaction that parallels the aesthetic pleasures found in snow-covered landscapes. The ladies of the manor organize their relief efforts with the same attention to detail they bring to planning dinner parties, creating committees and schedules, lists of deserving recipients, and appropriate donations. The work provides purpose for hours that might otherwise drag during the long winter months, transforming suffering witnessed from a distance into projects that fill empty time with virtuous activity. As the evening concludes and Lady Catherine prepares for sleep, her bedroom awaits with fires built high and warming pans passed between sheets that have been heated by servants who retired to their own cold quarters hours earlier. Her nightgown warmed by the fire and scented with lavender stored since summer transforms the act of undressing from the daily ordeal. It represents 4 village women into a ritual of luxurious comfort. The bed itself, with its heavy curtains and down-filled coverlets, creates a private world within the larger world of comfort. A nest of warmth so complete that the sound of wind outside becomes merely atmospheric, like music chosen to enhance rather than threaten sleep. Here, insulated by wealth and walls, by servants in social position, by heating systems and carefully managed resources, winter becomes transformed from season of survival into season of cozy contemplation, challenging only in its demand for creative approaches to entertainment and comfort. Yet perhaps the deepest difference between the manor and the village lies not in comfort, but in the relationship to community that winter demands. Where villagers like Mary Hartwell find strength in shared struggle, in the quiet cooperation that makes survival possible, the wealthy create community through the elaborate rituals of social display, through entertainments that demonstrate abundance rather than sharing scarcity. Both forms of community serve essential human needs, but they represent opposite responses to winter's fundamental challenge. The village creates bonds forged by mutual vulnerability, relationships strengthened by shared understanding of what it means to survive when resources are limited and comfort uncertain. The manor generates connections based on competitive display, associations that depend on maintaining distance from the struggles that define life for most of humanity. As midnight approaches and the fires begin to settle into glowing coals, servants make final rounds to ensure that warmth will last until morning's renewal, the 2 worlds of winter, survival, and ceremony. Desperation and abundance, village and manor, continue their parallel existence under the same star-scattered sky. Separated by more than miles or money, divided by entirely different understandings of what winter means and what human beings owe to each other. When the season tests the strength of both individual endurance and social bonds, the snow continues to fall on cottage and manor alike, but its meaning transforms depending on whether it is viewed from behind windows that frost from within or glass that remains clear, whether it represents beauty to be admired or hardship to be endured, whether it calls forth charity or survival, community or isolation, the luxury of aesthetic appreciation, or the desperate necessity of simply lasting until spring turns to make life generous once again. And so our quiet journey through winter's forgotten corners draws to its peaceful close. Like evening light fading slowly behind snow-laden trees, or the gentle settling of embers in a hearth that has warmed countless stories through the long dark hours of night. We have walked alongside Mary Hartwell as she bent over frozen streams, her hands growing numb in service to others' cleanliness, finding dignity in work that winter made almost impossibly difficult. We have felt the rough wool of village clothing against skin that knew cold as a constant companion, tasted the thin porridge that sustained life without providing comfort, breathed the smoky air of cottages where families gathered around fires too small for their needs, but large enough for hope. We have touched the mysterious artifacts buried beneath centuries of snow, those carved winter wheels and protective charms that speak of human beings reaching for meaning and control when the natural world seemed indifferent to their survival. In their careful rituals of protection, their patient creation of sacred objects from ordinary materials, we glimpse the profound truth that survival requires more than physical endurance. It demands the creation of meaning within hardship, the discovery of purpose within struggle, and we have glimpsed through frost-decorated windows. Another world entirely, Lady Catherine's realm of heated conservatories and imported oranges, where winter became aesthetic rather than enemy, where the same snow that threatened village life transformed manor grounds into living paintings, mired from the safety of warm drawing rooms. These parallel worlds, existing under the same gray skies and falling snow, remind us how completely circumstances can shape experience. How the accident of birth or fortune determines whether winter calls forth desperate creativity or comfortable charity, shared endurance or private abundance, community forged in struggle or society built on display. Yet perhaps what strikes us most deeply, as we settle into the warmth of our modern comfort, is not the differences between these Victorian lives, but their shared humanity. Whether breaking ice from morning basins or sipping chocolate from silver cups, whether carving protective charms from desperation or planning charity from abundance, whether gathering around fires that barely held back the cold or ones that blazed with generous warmth, all were human beings seeking connection, meaning, and the simple continuation of life through a season that tested every form of human resilience. The village women who bent over frozen streams, their hands red with cold and harsh soap, carried within themselves the same capacity for love, hope, and quiet heroism that we recognize in our own hearts. Their willingness to rise before dawn, to walk through snow, to work that paid barely enough for survival, to tend fires and mend clothes and share what little they had with neighbors in greater need. These acts represent a form of greatness that requires no monuments, no history books, no recognition beyond the simple fact that they made life possible for themselves and those they loved. Mary Hartwell's solitary cottage, warmed by carefully banked coals and lit by the flickering flame of a single candle, contained within its small space the same universe of human experience that exists in any home where people create meaning from the materials their circumstances provide. Her evening ritual of reading by firelight, her Sunday walks through snow to church, her patient mending of clothes that must last far longer than they were designed to endure. These quiet acts of persistence echo across the centuries to remind us that dignity is not a luxury of the wealthy, but a choice available to anyone who refuses to let hardship diminish their essential humanity. Even Lady Catherine's world of elaborate comfort speaks to universal human needs, though expressed through circumstances most of us will never know. Her morning rituals of dressing and correspondence, her afternoon social calls and evening entertainments, her charitable concerns for village families struggling through winter's worst months. These two represent attempts to find purpose and connection, to create meaning within the particular constraints and opportunities that wealth provided. The servants who made her comfort possible, rising in darkness to tend fires and prepare meals, carrying coal and hot water through corridors that never quite lost winter's chill, habited a middle ground between desperate poverty and luxurious ease. Their labor was essential, valued enough to provide steady employment and adequate food, yet invisible enough that history records few of their names or stories. They remind us that most human lives unfold in these middle spaces, neither desperate nor abundant, but quietly necessary to the functioning of whatever larger world their work makes possible. Tonight, as we drift toward sleep in homes heated by systems we rarely think about, warmed by energy sources that arrive without effort on our part, protected by walls and windows that keep winter at a comfortable distance, we carry with us the quiet wisdom of those who survived more difficult seasons, their patient endurance, their creative adaptation to circumstances they could not change, their discovery of joy and meaning within constraints that would challenge any modern conception of acceptable comfort. These lessons travel across time to offer us perspective on our own small struggles and daily choices. The winter wheels carved by forgotten hands and buried at village crossroads have long since crumbled to dust. But the intention they represented, the human refusal to accept powerlessness in the face of overwhelming natural forces, remains as relevant as ever. We still seek protection against the storms that life brings, still reach for symbols and rituals that provide comfort when logic offers little hope, still gather in communities of shared concern when individual resources prove insufficient for the challenges we face. The frost charms that once hung above cottage doorways, assembled from herbs and metals and whispered prayers, speak to the same impulse that drives us today to create meaning from materials and circumstances that might seem inadequate to the task. Every garden planted in spring, every photograph displayed on a mantle, every ritual that marks the passage of seasons or the significance of relationships represents the same human determination to find beauty and purpose within the ordinary materials that life provides. As you settle deeper into whatever comfort surrounds you now, warm blankets, soft pillows, the quiet hum of heating systems that maintain temperature without conscious effort, allow yourself to feel connected to that long chain of human endurance that stretches back through the Victorian villages and forward into whatever future awaits our descendants. You are part of a continuous story of survival and adaptation, creativity and resilience, individual struggle and community support that defines our species across all the seasons of history. The snow that once threatened Mary Hartwell's morning walk to work and decorated Lady Catherine's drawing room windows has melted into spring streams, evaporated into summer clouds, fallen again as autumn rain on generations of crops that fed populations who never knew those particular names or stories. But the patterns continue: need and abundance, isolation and community, struggle and comfort, individual endurance and collective support, playing out in forms adapted to whatever circumstances each generation inherits. Let your breathing slow now, matching the gentle rhythm of snow settling on quiet lanes, of embers glowing in banked fires, of night sounds muffled by winter's thick silence. Feel your body relaxing into warmth that you need not create or maintain through conscious effort, surrounded by walls that hold back cold without your vigilance. Resting in comfort that represents the accumulated labor and ingenuity of countless generations who dreamed of exactly this security, this ease, this freedom from the daily arithmetic of survival. Tomorrow, you will wake to circumstances unimaginably luxurious by the standards of any Victorian village. Light that responds to the touch of a switch, heat that flows from hidden sources, food transported from around the world and preserved by technologies that would seem magical to people who counted every lump of coal and stretched every meal to feed more mouths than it was intended to satisfy. But tonight, in this quiet hour between waking and sleep, you carry within your heart the same capacity for endurance, creativity and love that enabled Mary Hartwell to find dignity in hard work, village communities to create protection from materials and hope, wealthy families to transform isolation into charity, servants to find purpose in essential but unrecognized labor. You are the inheritor of their persistence, the beneficiary of their refusal to surrender in the face of circumstances that logic might have suggested were hopeless. Their quiet heroism lives on in every choice you make to continue when continuation is difficult, to find meaning when meaning is not obvious, to extend kindness when kindness is not required, to persist in hope when hope demands more faith than evidence might seem to justify. Sleep now in the comfort they dreamed of but never knew, warmed by the fires they built and tended through the long Victorian nights. Protected by the walls they constructed stone by stone against winter's assault, nourished by the communities they created through shared struggle and mutual care. Let their stories settle into your dreams like snow falling softly on fields that will bloom again when spring returns, like frost forming delicate patterns on windows that will clear with morning light, like embers glowing quietly in hearths that will flame again with tomorrow's awakening. The rhythm of their days, rise, work, endure, rest, rise again, continues in your own life, adapted to different circumstances, but driven by the same essential human determination to make meaning from whatever materials time and chance provide. Rest now in the comfort of knowing that you are part of this larger story, this continuing narrative of human resilience and creativity that spans the centuries and connects all of us who have ever faced uncertainty with hope, hardship with dignity, winter with the patient faith that spring always eventually returns. Let the gentle sounds of your own breathing join the whispered chorus of all those who have found peace in sleep after days of necessary work, who have rested in whatever comfort their circumstances allowed, who have closed their eyes on struggle and opened them on possibility, who have discovered that the most profound victories are often the quietest ones, the simple decision to continue, to care, to hope, to rest, and then to begin again. The winter winds that once threatened cottage windows now sing lullabies beyond your secure walls. The cold that once demanded such careful calculation now provides contrast that makes warmth precious rather than assumed. The darkness that once stretched so long now makes light welcome and rest complete. Thank you for letting this slow walk through history be part of your night. I share 3 or 4 new calming stories every week, and if this one helped you rest, you're invited to subscribe. Another gentle adventure is waiting on the screen, or you can join our little community below. May tonight's dreams be kind.